Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is Wednesday, February 25th, 2026. And to say the geopolitical temperature is high right now would be,
A massive understatement.
right, the understatement of the decade. If you've been tracking naval movements lately, you already know the situation. We've got two massive U.S. carrier strike groups.
The USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford.
Exactly. Just parked right off the coast of Iran. And it has all the hallmarks of an imminent kinetic event.
It really does. I mean, looking at the satellite imagery, you're seeing a concentration of firepower in the Persian Gulf that we just haven't witnessed since, since the early 2000s. You've got fifth-generation air wings, destroyers loaded with land attack cruise missiles. The whole package is just sitting there.
But here's the paradox, and it's really the reason we're diving into this specific topic today. While the military signals are screaming war, the diplomatic signals are whispering something completely different. They're whispering deal. In exactly 48 hours, on February 27th, diplomats are scheduled to meet in Geneva for a third round of talks brokered by Oman. So we have this absolute maximum military pressure sitting right alongside active diplomatic engagement.
It's a classic dual-track strategy, but it is incredibly high risk. And normally the commentary you see on this is just noise, it's just pundits on TV arguing about who's bluffing and who's serious.
Yeah, lots of yelling.
Exactly. But we aren't doing that today. We're looking at a genuinely fascinating new paper titled The U.S.-Iran Confrontation, a Bayesian game theoretic analysis of strategic scenarios.
By Fareed Novan.
Yes, by Fareed Novan.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because Bayesian game theory might sound a bit academic.
A bit dry.
Yeah, a bit dry. But for our listeners who follow these crises, this is actually the most practical way to cut through the fog. Because instead of just guessing what will happen, Novan is assigning actual probabilities based on different player types.
Right. The fundamental issue here is that geopolitics isn't chess. In chess, you have perfect information. I can see your knights, you can see my rooks. I know exactly what you can do.
Even if you don't know what they will do.
Exactly. But this situation, this is poker.
It's 100% poker.
It's a game of incomplete information. I don't know your cards. I don't know if you're holding a royal flush or just a pair of twos. I have to deduce your hand based entirely on your bets, on your signals.
And Bayesian analysis is essentially just a mathematical framework for that, right?
Right.
For updating your beliefs.
Your priors.
Yes, right. Updating your priors as new cards hit the table. The carriers off the coast are a card. The Geneva talks on the 27th are a card.
Precisely.
So the mission today is to figure out what the odds actually look like when you run the math on all this.
Yeah.
But before we get to the probabilities of war versus peace, we have to establish the context.
The priors.
The priors, exactly.
Yeah.
Because we aren't starting from a blank slate here. We're starting from the fallout of Operation Midnight Hammer.
Which was, only 8 months ago, June 2025.
Correct. And I think this is where a lot of the public confusion stems from. Back in June, the U.S. and Israel conducted those coordinated airstrikes. And President Trump came out and declared the Iranian nuclear program obliterated.
That was the exact word used.
Yes,
Yeah.
obliterated. Yet here we are in February 2026, and the U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, is openly saying Iran is weeks away from a bomb. So, was the assessment just wrong, or did those strikes fail?
The source paper argues it's more nuanced than just calling it a failure. The strikes were a temporal setback.
Okay.
They destroyed physical infrastructure, they hit the centrifuges, the power grids, the enrichment halls. But as Novan points out, you can bomb a building, but you cannot bomb knowledge.
The physics remain in the scientists' heads.
Exactly. The blueprints exist. And the response from Iran wasn't just to stubbornly rebuild what was already there. They adapted to the strike.
They hardened the target.
They dug much deeper, they dispersed the facilities across the country, and crucially, this is a massive variable in the paper's model, they upgraded their defensive posture.
Right, because Iran has integrated Chinese air defense technology that just wasn't there in June 2025.
Specifically, the YLC-8B 3D radar system combined with HQ-9B missile batteries.
I want to spend a minute on that radar, because hearing better radar sounds like a minor, almost technical detail. But the paper treats it as a massive strategic game changer. Why does the YLC-8B matter so much against cutting-edge U.S. tech?
It comes down to basic physics. U.S. stealth platforms like the F-35 sitting out there on those carriers right now are optimized to defeat high-frequency engagement radars.
The X-band stuff.
Right, the X-band radars. Those are the ones that actually lock onto a target to guide a missile to a direct hit. But the Chinese YLC-8B operates in the UHF band,
Which means longer wavelengths.
much longer wavelengths. And that creates a resonance effect that can actually detect the tail fins or the fuselage of stealth aircraft. Now, it's not accurate enough to guide a missile directly to the plane on its own, but it provides a track.
It gives them a general area.
It tells the Iranians, hey, there is something right here in this box of airspace.
So it completely strips away the element of surprise. The F-35 isn't a ghost anymore. It's a blip on a screen.
Exactly. And once they have that blip, they can queue up other systems, or more importantly, they can launch their own fighters to intercept. It means the concept of a clean victory is practically gone.
You mean an immaculate strike where we fly in, drop the ordnance, and leave without a single scratch?
Right. That becomes statistically highly unlikely. The cost function of the engagement has spiked dramatically.
Which brings us to the players in all this. In a Bayesian model, you have to assign a type to your opponent. You basically have to guess their psychology and resolve. How does Novin model the United States in this current crisis?
This part is fascinating because the U.S. is modeled as ambiguous, and the paper argues this ambiguity is very deliberate.
Strategic ambiguity.
Yes, the model assigns a 45% probability that the U.S. is a coercer. That means a player who is genuinely willing to initiate a war to force submission.
The sort of madman theory approach.
In a sense, yes. But there is a 55% probability that the U.S. is a dealer. A dealer uses the aircraft carriers purely as leverage. They're just betting chips on the table. The dealer has zero intention of actually striking. They just want to scare the opponent into signing that paper in Geneva.
Wow. That is a terrifyingly close margin. That is essentially a coin flip.
It really is.
So Iran has to look at the USS Gerald R. Ford parked right off their coast and guess, are they actually going to launch or are they just posing? And if Iran guesses wrong, they either get bombed or they fold unnecessarily and give up their leverage.
And the U.S. has to do the exact same calculus regarding Iran. The model suggests there's a 70% chance Iran is what it calls defiant but transactional.
Which means what, in plain English?
It means they are fundamentally rational actors focused on regime survival. They will talk, they will make a deal to avoid complete destruction, but they will not capitulate completely.
Right.
They won't give up their ballistic missile program or abandon their regional proxies, but they will trade their nuclear latency for safety.
Okay. And the other 30%?
Strategic submission. That would be a total folding of their hand. But the paper treats that as highly unlikely, simply given the immense domestic political costs that would incur in Tehran.
Okay, so those are the active players at the table. But the part of this deep dive that really caught my attention was the third-party beneficiaries.
Yes.
We really have to talk about the people standing behind the poker table watching the game, Beijing and Moscow.
This is the critical insight of the entire analysis. In a simple bilateral model, you just look at the U.S. versus Iran. But in a global game theory model, you have to factor in the incentives of China and Russia. And their incentive structure here is fascinatingly cynical.
Because they don't want World War III, right? I mean, China desperately needs Persian Gulf oil. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, the Chinese economy basically grinds to a halt.
Correct. They are distinctly risk-averse regarding a total blowout scenario. But, and this is the big variable that changes the math, they are also peace-averse.
They don't want war, but they don't want peace either. That sounds completely contradictory.
It does until you think about it from Beijing's perspective. If the U.S. and Iran actually sign a durable, lasting peace deal in Geneva, what happens to those two massive carrier strike groups?
So they leave, they pack up and head straight to the South China Sea.
Exactly. A stable Middle East frees up American bandwidth, resources, and naval assets to focus entirely on the Indo-Pacific. China and Russia absolutely do not want that.
Right.
Their optimal outcome is what the source calls the attrition trap. They want the U.S. engaged, but stuck. They want a simmering, incredibly expensive, resource-draining conflict that keeps Washington constantly distracted.
So for China, a good outcome here is the U.S. spending billions of dollars and years of political attention chasing shadows in the Zagros Mountains, rather than bolstering defenses in Taiwan.
Precisely. It is a massive resource burn. Every single week the U.S. spends managing a crisis in the Persian Gulf is a week they aren't building coalitions or deploying assets in Asia.
That sets the stage perfectly. We have the players, the improved Iranian defense tech, and the highly cynical third-party observers. Now, let's actually get to the predictions. Novin's paper calculates 4 distinct scenarios for how this entire standoff ends. Let's walk through them, starting with the one the diplomats are praying for on the 27th.
Right. Scenario A, diplomatic resolution. The model gives this a 35% probability.
That is not overwhelming.
No, it's not. It is the highest single probability of the 4, but it's still relatively low. This is the rational outcome. A deal gets struck in Geneva. It restricts Iran's nuclear work, restores international inspections, but it keeps the current regime in power.
And mathematically speaking, this works out because it has positive utility for everyone involved.
Exactly. It's the only scenario where every single player, the US, Iran, China, and the global economy, ends up with a positive payoff. The US gets non-proliferation without firing a shot. Iran gets regime survival and sanctions relief. China gets energy stability.
It's the Nash equilibrium.
It is the Nash equilibrium of the game, provided everyone acts rationally.
But as we know, history is absolutely full of people acting irrationally.
Very true.
So let's look at the alternatives. Scenario B, limited strike or coercive success. 20% probability. This is basically the shock and awe approach.
This is the scenario where the U.S. believes that if they just hit Iran hard enough, say a massive 48-hour intensive air campaign, Iran will simply fold and surrender to demands.
And the source is pretty dismissive of this idea, right?
Highly dismissive. Novin calls this the weaker adversary fallacy. We saw it in Vietnam, we saw it in Afghanistan, in Iraq. There is this persistent tendency in Washington to assume that just because you have a exponentially larger GDP and better fighter planes, you can automatically dictate the political outcome.
But political resolve doesn't scale with GDP.
No, it doesn't. Iran has a population of 90 million people and massive territorial depth. The idea that a limited bombing run causes them to just wave a white flag is statistically flawed. They are far more likely to absorb the hit and escalate.
Which leads us directly into scenario C. And this is the one I want to really dig into because the paper flags this as the absolute most dangerous outcome for American grand strategy. The attrition trap.
Scenario C, with a 30% probability. And to be clear, this is the exact scenario China is actively rooting for.
Walk us through it. What does the attrition trap actually look like on the ground?
It is not a ground invasion. It's not D-Day. It is an inconclusive, grinding air and naval war that stretches on for months, maybe longer. The U.S. is bombing command centers and radar sites. Iran is firing volleys of ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in the region. Proxy groups are constantly harassing commercial shipping.
Just a mess.
A total mess. But the key danger here isn't the fighting itself. It's the munitions exhaustion.
This is the industrial base argument we hear so much about.
It is. Think about what it takes to hit those Iranian targets. We established they are buried deep underground or defended by that new Chinese radar. So the U.S. has to use its absolute highest-end tools. We are talking about JSMERs, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, LRASMs, Tomahawks.
And we do not have an infinite supply of those in the stockpile.
We have a very finite supply. And crucially, the production lead time for these advanced weapons is measured in years. You can't just spin up a factory and produce 1,000 advanced guidance chips next week.
I see exactly where this is going. These are the precise missiles we need for the Pacific Theater.
They're the exact same missiles. If you fire 2,000 JSSMs into the Iranian mountains just to degrade their nuclear program by a few years, that is 2,000 JSSMs that are no longer available to deter a Chinese blockade of Taiwan.
Wow. So in scenario C, the U.S. might technically win the engagement in the Gulf. They might blow up the bunkers, but they strategically disarm themselves against their primary threat.
Exactly. The paper refers to this dynamically as a strategic externality. China basically wins scenario C without firing a single shot. They simply sit back and watch the U.S. degrade its own magazine depth against a secondary opponent. It creates this massive window of opportunity in East Asia that might not have existed otherwise.
That is a deeply sobering way to look at it. It's not just about whether we can blow up the target, it's about what we actually have left in the cupboard afterwards.
And remember, the geography of Iran exacerbates all of this. The paper specifically highlights the tyranny of distance. The targets inside Iran can be 1,300 miles away from the carrier operating box in the Gulf.
Which means planes need mid-air refueling. They need tankers.
Lots of tankers. Big, slow, highly vulnerable Boeing KC-46s or KC-135s. To sustain a prolonged air campaign in scenario C, you have to put those tankers in the air constantly. And if Iran or one of their proxies manages to threaten those tankers, the whole operation creates a logistical nightmare.
It just becomes incredibly expensive, slow, and draining on the entire force.
Precisely.
Okay, so scenario C is the trap. The final one is scenario D, regional escalation. 15% probability.
This is the global nightmare scenario. Iran attempts to completely close the Strait of Hormuz. They put mines in the water, anti-ship missiles flying at everything that moves.
Oil prices go vertical.
We're talking $150, maybe $200 a barrel. A global recession hits immediately. The reason this probability is the lowest at 15% is that absolutely nobody wants this. China hates this because they rely on importing that oil. The EU hates it.
Even Iran hates it.
Right, because Iran still needs to smuggle out their own petroleum exports to survive. It is the suicide pill option.
So, stepping back and looking at all four scenarios, we have a 35% chance of a diplomatic deal, but a combined 50% chance if you add scenario C and scenario B of some kind of conflict that likely degrades the U.S. strategic position globally.
The math suggests the odds of a bad strategic outcome are significantly higher than the odds of a good one, unless that diplomatic track in Geneva actually succeeds.
So what is the takeaway here? The so what? If you are a G7 leader sitting at a desk reading Novin's paper right now, what is the play?
The conclusion is highly counterintuitive for the foreign policy hawks. The source argues that the game theory optimal move for the United States is actually diplomacy.
But not of any sense of pacifism or trust.
No, out of absolute ruthlessness toward the bigger picture. You choose diplomacy with Iran specifically to block China and Russia from getting the distraction they are so desperate for.
You sign the deal in Geneva to keep your powder dry for the Pacific.
Correct. The paper frames the choice not as strength versus weakness, which is how it's usually debated on TV. It frames it as immediate coercive action versus disciplined coalition management.
That's a great distinction.
If the U.S. strikes, it feels strong in the moment. It satisfies that immediate political urge to do something. But if that strike turns into the attrition trap of scenario C, the U.S. effectively hands a massive structural advantage to Beijing.
It's having the discipline to say, look, I am not going to fight this secondary battle right now because I need to be ready for the primary one.
And that requires communicating to your allies and to your own domestic audience that making a deal isn't capitulation. It is strategic prioritization. Novin actually suggests the G7 should be privately signaling this to Washington right now, saying, we support you, but we need you focused on the Indo-Pacific and Eastern Europe. Do not get stuck in the sand.
It really reframes all the news we're going to see this week. When we see the headlines about the Geneva talks on the 27th, it is so easy to think it's just about centrifuge counts and uranium enrichment percentages. But based on this deep dive, those talks are actually about the global balance of power for the next decade.
Absolutely. The centrifuge count is just the surface issue. The real issue is U.S. capacity. Can the U.S. maintain its deterrence posture in Asia if it burns its high-end inventory in the Middle East? And the answer, according to the Bayesian math, is likely no.
And we haven't even touched on the fact that if we do bomb them, as you said earlier, they just rebuild it all anyway.
The temporal setback. You buy yourself maybe 2 or 3 years of delay on their nuclear program, but at the cost of your strategic reserve. Is that trade actually worth it? The Bayesian model suggests the expected utility of that trade is negative.
This has been a massive eye-opener. It completely moves the conversation from, are we tough enough, to, are we smart enough?
That is the power of using a game theory framework. It forces you to look at the second and third order effects. In a complex geopolitical system, the most obvious move, just hit the bad guy, is very often the exact move your real opponent is praying you make.
So here is the bottom line from the source material. The U.S. undoubtedly has the military power to destroy Iranian infrastructure. That is not in question at all. But exercising that power might actually cause them to lose the global game against China and Russia due to sheer exhaustion and distraction.
The tactical victory instantly becomes a strategic defeat.
I want to leave you with a thought to mull over as you watch the news unfold on February 27th. The paper poses a really heavy question. In a world defined by game theory, are we actually playing our own hand, or are we being played by the people watching quietly from the sidelines?
That is the exact question that should be on the cover of every briefing book in Washington right now.
When you see the footage of those carrier strike groups tomorrow, ask yourself, who actually benefits the most if those jets launch? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll be watching the dice roll in Geneva right along with you.
Stay analytical and always keep your eye on the whole board.
See you next time.